Mr. Litton, I've been asked to repeat the question one more time. What are the main disadvantages of commissioning a COI to look into the social unrest?
Now, let's again examine the practicalities, first of all. Before you actually even set up the body, the persons appointed to discharge the function of commissioner, before you even get to that point, you need to assemble a very big staff who are able to go out and take witness statements from a huge range of people. Now, that of course depends upon your terms of reference. But as far as I can see, if you want to appease public opinion, you cannot just confine the investigation to a very narrow focus, because people would say you haven't covered the whole spectrum of police brutality, if you like. So if you narrow it to try to make it work, well, you have complaint. If you widen it, then you have completely impractical problems to resolve. To start with, how many witnesses are you going to start having statements from? It will have to be, obviously, from, first of all, the CE, Commissioner of Police, etc., etc. Now, that would take months before you even begin the first sitting and call witnesses. And it's not, as was explained just now, it's not an investigative body. The body is actually not going out. It's, the commissioners are not going out and taking questions from the CE and so on. They are sitting there waiting for the witnesses to appear before them. You see the practical difficulties involved. So quite apart from the problem of devising the terms of reference, which itself would invite controversy, even if you can settle the terms of reference, which will, I think, have to be wide, it can't be very narrow, because, all factors have to be taken into account. And what is more, it is an ongoing process. You write the terms of reference for now. What's going to happen next week? Will there be an investigation on the burning down of Lechco chambers? Burning down of Government House? You can't, in practical terms, have an ongoing situation and somehow, like a movie, freeze it at that point and expect some satisfactory result to investigate the frozen scenario when you have an ongoing situation. So I would simply add to what has been said. May I contradict you, sir, on one thing? You say people of whatever color. My view is that all of us in this room are multicolored. Depends upon what issue you are dealing with. We apply our critical faculties to the issue we deal with. If you ask me, am I pro-Beijing? Of course I'm pro-Beijing, and so is every one of you. We are part of China. The legitimate government of China resides in Beijing. If you ask me whether I'm pro-democrat, I would say, of course I'm pro-democrat. After all, I live most of the time in a democratic country. With all its faults, it is a peaceful country with prevailing democracy. You ask me whether I believe in universal suffrage. I say, well, in principle, yes, I suppose, but what exactly do you mean by universal suffrage? Now, if by universal suffrage you mean that the voting procedure is one person, one vote, one man, one vote, now, who would be in the White House now? It would not be Donald Trump. He lost by 3 million votes to Hillary Clinton. But their democratic system is such that it is Donald Trump in the White House. And what's more, some way back, same thing happened. Al Gore had the far more popular vote in his favor than George W. Bush. And who sits and he was there for 8 years. George W. Bush lost by universal suffrage, but gained by the democratic system that they had in place. So I mean, these labels, are you yellow, are you blue? If you ask me, I'm everything. I'm black as well, very black sometimes. I have very black thoughts. But hopefully, the more angelic side of my nature usually comes out. And usually I feel humanity and love and kinship with my fellow human beings. But there are times when the black side is very resentful and angry. So I think the question of are you yellow, are you blue, just shows the shallowness of approach of the people who make those definitions. And for that to be the view of university students who are there to develop their critical thinking, enlarge their horizon, and so on, to me is a great sadness.
Thank you, Mr. Litton. Is it a good idea to set up a COI to look into specific incidents, such as the Yuen Long 721 incident and the Prince Edward 831 incident?
Well, that question has been very well covered just now, and I don't think there's really very much I can add to it. Exactly what I've been considering, first of all, the terms of reference, and how wide is the scope, how limited is the scope. Is it to investigate individual suspected crimes committed by individual members of the police force over a period of 6 months? Now, when you talk about police brutality, I mean, it's a meaningless term. The police is a generic term embodying 30-odd thousand men. Now, you're not saying that 30,000 men are brutal. So when you talk about police brutality, you're really isolating specific instances where it is alleged that more than reasonable force has been exercised in discharging their compulsory duty. Don't forget, the police are a disciplined force under orders, and they're dealing with violent criminals who are violently resisting arrest. So what degree of force you might reasonably exercise in order to achieve the object of arrest, I mean, is of course open to debate. I mean, one thing is sure, you need force. They're not going to come and say, hola, Sir, 我而家投降啦, 你而家 I mean, have you heard any of them saying that?
Do you believe that the speed of prosecution and the court process is reasonable or too slow? Any suggestion which can help with the situation?
Well, I mean, just look at the facts. The umbrella movement started in 2014, and that resulted in some convictions. Now, it's only very recently that the principal offenders involved in those crimes have been released from prison, even though their terms of imprisonment were very short. Now, what does that tell you? How speedy was that process? Okay? Obviously, very slow. Now, I'm not saying whether it's too slow, I'm just saying very slow. Let's look at the present situation now. We were told, I think, in the newspapers yesterday, that over 4,000 people have been arrested, and I think yesterday there were many more, 200 more. So over 4,000 have been arrested, and only 500 have been charged, right? Now, what's happened to the rest? The ones who have been arrested. The process of justice is meant to be seamless. The duty of the police is to bring criminals to justice, okay? That means that when they have begun their period of detention on arrest, the police have 48 hours to get their act together, lay the charges, bring them before a magistrate, and the prisoner has been brought to justice. It's now the justice system that takes over, and it's the magistrates who then determine whether, having, in light of the charge, whether the person should be in detention pending trial, or to be released on bail, and what the conditions of bail are. Right? Now, that process seems to have been completely stalled in Hong Kong. 6 months into this crisis, we have not seen a single conviction or acquittal by a court of a really serious offense. Now, what does that tell you about the speed of prosecution process that you've just asked me about?
How was double universal suffrage promised under the Basic Law and the Joint Declaration?
Okay, that question I've anticipated. Okay, now there are two provisions in the Basic Law. There's Article 45 and there's Article 68. Okay, now Article 45 deals with the appointment and selection of the Chief Executive. And written into our Constitution in Article 45 is the nominating committee, right? It is the nominating committee which by democratic means selects a candidate for appointment. And as you probably know, the resolution of the National People's Congress of the 31st of August 2014 has a model whereby 2 or 3 candidates would emerge from that selection process by the nominating committee, and those 2 or 3 candidates would then be put to universal suffrage by vote of all registered voters as to which of the 3, one person, one vote, should go forward to be appointed as the chief executive. Now, that is where universal suffrage comes into play in Article 45. In Article 68 is a different thing. That deals with Legislative Council. And that says that in accordance with the steady progress, the ultimate aim is that legislative councillors should be elected by universal suffrage. And that is in Article 68. And at the moment, we are halfway there, in a sense, because of the 70 legislative councillors, 35 are elected from geographical constituencies, and that is one person, one vote. Whereas in the functional constituencies, well, it's democratic within, of course, each of those constituencies. Still is one person, one vote, but not, I think, what would come within the title, the label of universal suffrage. So we are halfway there in terms of the Legislative Council, and the model put forward by the NPC, the National People's Congress, was one which the Democrats rejected.
Say a person deliberately breaks the law, should he or she generally be subject to the full force of the law, and in what circumstance may an amnesty be justifiable?
Wow, now that's a big one. You're talking about two wholly different things. Now, within the justice system, there is some room for mercy, but that is only upon conviction. All right? Let's say, taking what we can see as happening in Hong Kong today. Let's say that someone is now convicted of rioting, say, taking part in a riotous assembly. But when you examine the individual circumstance, you realize that this is say a 4th-year medical student from the Chinese U, right? Who hasn't been out at all, but got pressurized by friends, by his peers, to take part, to show solidarity with his comrades and so on. And on that one occasion, he's actually been caught. Now, he hasn't got a weapon in his hand. He doesn't wear a mask. He was just on the fringe of the riotous assembly. But that label, riotous assembly, of participation in a riotous assembly, is as bright and effective in law on the man who is wielding an iron bar and breaking institutions and beating up the police as the man who just tagged along on the fringe. He's still taking part, right? So when it comes to sentence, the court has shades of guilt still to consider. And may well be that in a meritorious case, the court may well say, look, in these exceptional circumstances, I'm not going to be responsible for blighting your career forever on this one incident when you took part, when there's so much in your favor, and there's no doubt that, you'll be bitterly sorry that you ever went out that night at all. Now, these are factors that can be weighed in the scales of justice, but only when the process of justice has taken its course. And the problem in Hong Kong at the moment is that that process of justice does not appear to have even begun. Not a single case of attempted murder, of arson and so on has ever appeared in court. Why? I don't know. I mean, this is to me a really troubling aspect of what's happening in Hong Kong today.
Do you agree that there should be a special court to deal with these cases?
I think you should ask the CJ that. I'm not going to answer a question like that. What I can tell you is that when a crisis situation of a minor kind occurred in Britain about 4 years ago, I mean, what happened was that the normal process of justice continued, but they had courts sitting 24 hours a day, night courts. Weekends, holidays, court system continued. It was a seamless process. Those who are in doubt of conviction are acquitted. Those who have proved to be beyond reasonable doubt to have been guilty are convicted, sentenced. Now, how is it that the Hong Kong system seems to be stalled? I don't know.
What does rule by law and rule by man mean? Are you aware of any substantive evidence of this happening in Hong Kong?
Well, it depends on how tyrannical you are when you are in the house with your family, I suppose. That would be, in my house, is ruled by woman. I think these are just labels. I mean, they would like to label, for example, a government in the mainland as ruled by man. Now, that is far, far too simplistic a way of looking at things, because the system is different and so on, and the structure is different, and you don't have the checks and balances that visibly appear in our society. We say that, well, we are therefore governed by the rule of law, and the rest, is rule of man. Well, I mean, these are just labels. I think people should not be mesmerized by labels. I think that's part of the problem in Hong Kong. The young people seem to have got mesmerized by these big words: freedom, freedom, freedom to burn others. Democracy. Well, I mean, democracy gave Mr. Donald Trump the presidency of the United States. Now, how many people in this room think that was a good thing that happened? I'm expressing no view, by the way.
Why do we need IPCC or COI? Can the victims not just commence a normal litigation proceeding, or otherwise rely on the current prosecution and judicial systems?
We're really talking about very different issues. Of course, if somebody has committed a serious assault upon you, you have a common law cause of action and you can sue for damages. Now, that is a civil process. But when you're talking about the IPCC, now that is a statutory body, as in fact has been well explained, which has essentially a supervisory function over the activities of CAPO. And that is therefore a completely different process. That is not an organ that can give you compensation for assault, if that is what you complain of. It's merely investigative. So really, you're talking about completely different things altogether when you're talking about a civil process for civil remedy in a civil court for damages for a tort done to you, an investigative body like the IPCC or a commission of inquiry established under the Commission of Inquiry Ordinance.
Some protesters said the main differences between IPCC and COI are number one, member composition, and number two, scope of investigative powers. Do you agree with that?
Now, let's look at what they say about the problem of member composition. Now, the person having the responsibility of appointing, that means to appoint the particular members to serve, and at present, of course, we do have the IPCC, and I think they've been added to by 2 additional members quite recently, and also they have also invited an international panel of experts to give advice to them, and I think that those are 5 people. Those 5 have been invited to come to Hong Kong, I think probably on the recommendation of the chairman of the IPCC, but the actual appointment is done by the chief executive. And when it comes to the membership of the IPCC itself, under the ordinance, the person appointing is the chief executive. Now, therein lies the problem. Public confidence is lost on the chief executive. So whatever she does at the moment, nobody can feel that they can rely upon it. I think rightly or wrongly, in my opinion, when you are in a crisis situation as grave as that of Hong Kong, and there is only, at the moment, only one leader, whatever you think about the leader, however unsatisfactory you feel, as it is the only leader, the only way forward is to give her support. There is no other way. The other way, who do you then put your trust on? Wang Jifeng? Well, I mean, he complained, you see, that it was Beijing, you remember, he said, who had actually blighted his political career in Hong Kong. And during the interview by Chugani, I was asked to comment. And I looked at the picture, and I said, well, Beijing, I mean, that's, the government of one of the most powerful countries on earth, with a permanent seat on the Security Council, with a population of 1.4 billion people to look after. I mean, who is Wang Jifeng? I mean, they may even say, 是什么? 香港是什么? I mean, Wang Jifeng, come on. Well, don't forget, the individual police officers are members of a disciplined force. So the responsibility for their action really cannot fall on the individual police officers who are actually conducting the whatever thing they have to do to arrest. Well, that generally is what they have to do. But of course, by arrest, they've got to actually overcome the person to be arrested. And that must mean the use of force. Now, how in a situation where your own life is under threat, you can exercise judgment as a lawyer? On the one hand this, on the one hand that. I mean, you act also all on instinct, on impulse, and whatever training you've got, and you do your best. Now, to say that you can then try to find fault in that situation, to me, is most unjust. Whether the commanding officer exercised the right judgment, now that's a different consideration. Now, it depends on what resources they have at their disposal, right? And if they judge that it's only, say, bean bags and what it is needed, well, then they would use that and nothing more. But if in fact none of that works, then I suppose you just have to use as much force as possible to do whatever you need to do. Now, one thing is sure, how can you tolerate a bunch of criminals occupying a bridge over Tolo Highway forever? That's for sure you can't. So there has to be a resolution one way or another. And talking is not the way out, obviously. Because the more time you talk, the more they arm themselves, it would appear.